So, welcome to our first vocab video this semester that I will be doing, and it's for Psychology 205, which is behavioral analysis. So, here's our table of contents. I would think it's pretty straightforward. Six main things to consider. So, what is behavior? Well, there are some things that behavior can be defined as. It is the actions that people have, it can be measured, it is observed, described, and recorded, and it has an impact on the environment. And as a two-way street, the environment also impacts the behavior as well. Two ways we can see behavior is overt or covert. Overt is external behaviors such as drinking, eating, blinking, all those things. And covert can be things such as thinking and, your heartbeat, all of those things. How I usually remember these is that covert is like covering, like under a blanket or something, and an overt is outside with the O. So here are some dimensions of behavior, and I will be using the example of a race to express each of these dimensions. So frequency is how many times something has occurred. So something in a race that we can count as frequency is how many times does the runner's foot hit the floor during a certain racing period. Duration is how long a behavior lasts. So in a race, this is probably how long the racer took from the beginning to the end. Intensity is how much energy was put into the behavior. So in this case, we would say that intensity is how hard the runner is running, and latency is the speed of the behavior. So how long it takes from the start of the initial event to the start of behavior. So the alarm beeping to the racer taken off would be the latency period. So the applied science in which we analyze and modify behavior is called behavior modification. And we have to implement procedures to change behaviors, but we also have to know what causes like certain behaviors to happen before we go in to change the behavior. That is very important to remember. So here are some characteristics of behavior modifications, and the book goes more in detail into these, but these are, of course, very important to know. What is target behavior? Well, target behavior is the behavior that we want to modify as observers. There is a behavior deficit in which the desirable behavior, we want to increase the behavior. And then a behavior excess, on the other hand, is an undesirable trait that we want to decrease. So there's indirect and direct assessments. So indirect are ones that occur when we're just doing recollections of behaviors. So this can be like interviews and questionnaires and rating scales. We are not looking at the behavior directly. And direct is the opposite. We are observing the target's behavior as it occurs. So this can be through a recording, or we are actually in the room with the behaviorer in this case. So there are three main types of IOAs you should know. There's the total agreement, and this is the amount of times the observer agree out of all the intervals of recorded time. There's the occurrence, which is the amount of times the observers agreed out of all the times they thought there was an occurrence, and non-occurrence is the amount of times observers agreed out of the times where at least one of them thought it was a non-occurrence. If this is something that you're struggling to like straighten out, there are two videos that go into IOA. So ways to record these kind of behaviors are there's the self-monitoring way or the IOA, which we just said. In a self-monitoring way, this is usually used when the observer cannot observe the behavior themselves constantly, like throughout a day. And an IOA is usually when two people individually record a behavior and they can come together and compare results. There can also always be more than two people, but two people right now is convenient for us to understand the concept. When and where do we record? Well, there's an observation period, and this is the time when the behavior typically occurs. And this is when we observers want to observe the behavior. So there are two types of settings in which we can record behavior. There's the analog setting, which is an area that is not part of a person's regular routine, such as a clinic or mostly a clinic. And a natural setting, an area where one usually displays the behavior that we are targeting. So maybe like a classroom or the house. So there's also many types of observations, such as unstructured and structured. So structured are usually ones where the observer will actually create specific events or instructions for the person to go through. And there's unstructured, where there's really no specified activity or event. And there's like no instructions given to the behaviorer, so we can observe what would they do naturally. Here are some recording methods. So there's continuous recording, which is recording every instance of the behavior in a period of time. There's percentage of opportunities, which is the occurrence of behavior in relation to another event. Product recording, and product recording only works when the behavior results in tangible outcome. Interval recording, which is dividing the period into numbers of smaller periods to observe. And time sampling, in which you also divide the periods into smaller period, and you only are viewing it at certain parts of the interval. Here are types of interval recordings. There's partial interval, which the observer scores only if the behavior happens at any period of the interval recording. There's whole interval, which the observer only scores if the behavior lasts the whole entire interval. And frequency within interval. The observer records how many times something happens in a time interval. So in a partial recording, say if we're observing someone drinking, right? If they're only say that we are dividing the intervals into like sections of 10 seconds. In a partial interval, if the person is sipping the cup at 1 second, during that 10 second, we will count it. But on the other hand, in a whole interval, if they're only sipping it for 1 second within the whole interval, we do not count it. Only if they're drinking for the full 10 seconds will we count it. And frequency within interval is how many times someone does it. So inside the 10 seconds, how many times are they drinking? And that is about it. So thank you so much.